This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 348 entitled Avoiding the False Cause Fallacy. Yes, we're continuing to work through our series in which we study the logical fallacies so that we know whether or not we are committing them, we know whether other people are committing them, and we can find helpful tips to avoid falling prey to using these logical fallacies. So as I mentioned, this week's episode is going to examine the false cause fallacy. What's the false cause fallacy? Well, that occurs when somebody assumes that because one event follows another, the first event must have caused the second event. It's an error in reasoning where a causal relationship is incorrectly inferred based solely on the chronological sequence or some weak connection between the two events. So what are the common ways in which the false cause fallacy is committed in the year 2024? Why is this fallacy unhelpful in our dialogues about the Trinity and the nature of Christology and whether Jesus is God? And how should we debate and discuss theology without falling prey to the false cause fallacy? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining the false cause fallacy. So as we already alluded to, the false cause fallacy occurs when it is incorrectly assumed that because one event followed another, the first event absolutely must have caused the second event. This logical error mistakes correlation for causation, or more simply put, it assumes that there is a causal relationship without there being sufficient evidence to indicate that there is a relationship between the first and second event. So, what are some common false cause example fallacies? So, a silly one might be that ice cream sales and incidents of people drowning increase at the same time during the summer. Now, someone might say, well, the sales of ice cream increase and the number of people that drown increase around the same time, so there must be a connection between the two. But eating ice cream doesn't cause drowning. Both events are just simply influenced by the warmer weather, but there's no causal relationship between the two of them. Another example is to say that if crime rates rise after a new policy is put into place, then attributing the increase of the crime directly to that policy might actually be an example of the false cause fallacy, because it might overlook other contributing factors such as social unrest or economic downturns. Now, something that people who play sports or they play games commonly will talk about, usually they're talking about it in a joking fashion, but I think some people actually believe this. They talk about having lucky pieces of clothing or lucky dice, or in this particular example, someone saying that I wore my lucky pair of socks, and because I wore them, my team won the match. They won the game. Therefore, my socks must have caused the win. But I'm pretty sure that this win was due to factors unrelated to the socks that you had on your feet. It was probably related to the strategy of the team or the skill of the individual players on the team, because there's no such thing as lucky socks. The correlation there is not necessarily causation. Here's another example. Someone saying that unemployment increased because the government raised the taxes. But the economy is fairly complex. There are many factors that are involved in it, such as automation, global trade, or the trends of the industry, and those factors probably had a much greater contribution to the rising unemployment rates. Just because the government raised taxes doesn't necessarily prove that people are losing their jobs at a greater rate. How about this one? Blaming video games, particularly violent video games, for the uprise in violent behavior in society. And this actually has been disproven by several scientists, but this correlation overlooks really the lack of evidence proving a direct causal relationship between video games and the behavior of those who play them. So why is the false cause fallacy fallacious? Well, the first reason is that it mistakes correlation for causation. The fallacy assumes that just because two events occurred together, or one after the other, the first one must have caused the other. However, correlation does not imply causation. Two events can happen together for reasons unrelated to one another, and other factors may be responsible for both. Number two, it overlooks alternative explanations. A false cause fallacy often ignores the possibility that there could be other causes or variables at play. The assumption that one event caused the event that came right after is often made too quickly without the consideration of other potential explanations for the effect. Number three, the after this, therefore because of this reasoning, which is described in Latin as the post hoc reasoning. The assumption that because one event followed the other, the first event must have caused the second is fallacious. It's a temporal fallacy that's based on sequence, but not actually on causality and the evidence at play. Number four is that it's just a oversimplification of the data. This fallacy simplifies complex systems or events by assuming a single cause for a particular outcome, when in reality, life is far more complex, there are multiple causes, and there are many variables at play that could have been involved. And number five, the failure to demonstrate a logical connection. This is probably the biggest reason why the false cause fallacy is fallacious. For an argument to be valid, it must demonstrate a logical connection between the cause and the effect. It can't just simply be assumed and stated. There has to be evidence provided, and there has to be an argument that's actually made that's convincing. In the false cause fallacy, the connection is just simply assumed or stated, but it's not actually proven. There's no supporting evidence that the first event directly caused the second event. So, enough about the hypotheticals. Let's move to our second point, which is the common false cause fallacies in Christological debates. Most people listening to this podcast are interested in biblical Unitarian theology, and they're aware that there was a development of the doctrine of the Trinity and an elevation in the Christological portrayal of the person of Jesus in church history. And several of the arguments made in order to legitimize the conclusions of these developments are based on fallacious claims. So, the first fallacy we'll look at is the statement that the doctrine of the Trinity developed in the early Christian church. Therefore, it must be true because the early Christians were naturally closer to Jesus and the apostles. But this is fallacious. This argument assumes that the chronological proximity of the early Christians to Jesus ensures doctrinal accuracy of what those later Christians actually were teaching and believing. This overlooks the fact that early doctrinal development involved several significant debates, and they were influenced by external factors, such as anti-Semitism and Greek philosophy, not just the proximity to Jesus' teachings. Here's a second fallacy. Jesus is called a man in several passages of the New Testament, and he's also called God in one or two passages, like John 20:28 and Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. Therefore, because Jesus is called man and he's called God, it proves that the doctrine of the two natures of Christ must have been held by the authors of the New Testament. But this is fallacious. While there are texts that do call Jesus a human being, and others that apply the title God to Jesus, it does not follow that Jesus is fully God and fully man in the Chalcedonian sense of the term. And that was described in 451, over 400 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Several other figures in the Old Testament, like Moses, the Israelite judges, and the Israelite king, were also human beings to whom were attributed the title God. And this actually makes for a more suitable context to interpret Jesus' designations. Fallacy number 3. The Bible uses the terms Father, Son, and Holy Spirit together in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19, so this proves that Matthew taught and believed the doctrine of the Trinity. But this is fallacious. While Matthew 28:19 does mention the Father, Son, and Spirit, assuming that this verse automatically proves the doctrine of the Trinity is a massive leap in logic. The false cause fallacy lies in assuming that just because the three terms appear together in a triad, it directly causes or proves the complex theological idea of co-equal, co-eternal persons in the one God, about which the text of Matthew 28:19 says absolutely nothing. So critics are right to argue that this particular interpretation of Matthew 28:19 goes far beyond the plain text of Scripture, the plain meaning of the passage, and how the passage could have been understood by first century Jewish Christians. Fallacy number 4. Jesus calmed the storm and he walked on water. So he must be God because this is what Yahweh does in the Old Testament. But this is fallacious. While it is true that Jesus held control over nature and he performed miraculous miracles, the assumption that this ability proves that he is Yahweh is a false cause fallacy. There are other biblical figures, like Moses and Elijah, who performed similar nature-related miracles, and no one thought that they were divine, no one thought that they were Yahweh. So this fallacy lies in assuming that the ability to perform miracles equates to divinity, to where a more suitable context would suggest that Jesus is a highly empowered human agent of God, who has been anointed with power at his baptism in order to perform these miracles. Fallacy number 5. The early Christians worship Jesus. Therefore, this proves that Jesus must be God and part of the triune God. But this is fallacious. This argument assumes that worshiping Jesus necessarily equates to belief in the Trinitarian understanding of God. While it is true that the New Testament does depict Jesus being worshipped, it does not necessarily follow that the early Christians understood this worship in Trinitarian terms, especially when viewed in light of Jewish monotheism and worship being offered to several other highly qualified human beings in the Old Testament, particularly Solomon in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 20. The causal connection between the worship of Jesus and later Trinitarian theology is not sufficiently demonstrated. Fallacy number 6. Most major Christian denominations teach the Trinity, therefore it must be the correct interpretation of biblical theology. But this is almost certainly fallacious. This argument assumes that widespread acceptance of a doctrine implies its truthfulness. However, the popularity of a belief does not prove that it is correct. Many theological ideas throughout history have been popular and widely accepted for long periods of time, but have since been widely rejected. The fallacy lies in assuming that popularity equals causation. So, how can we avoid committing the false cause fallacy now that we can define it, we can recognize it, and we can see it being used fallaciously in debates about Christology? How can we keep ourselves from falling prey to committing the false cause fallacy? This is our third and final point. So here are some tips that you can use in your life in order to keep you from committing this fallacy. Number 1, we need to avoid assumptions based on a simple sequence. Just because one event follows another, don't assume that the first event caused the second event. You can't just assume that. Always question whether the connection is real or whether it's just coincidental. Ask yourself, is it possible that these two events happened independently of each other? If that's possible, then the connection is just likely to be coincidental. Number 2, actively look for alternative explanations. We should consider whether other factors might be contributing to the outcome. It's very easy to overlook complex variables. So we should identify other possible causes or contributing factors before concluding a specific cause. And sometimes other people are able to see and discern these alternative explanations, and so being open to dialoguing with others and listening to the perspectives of others is very helpful in avoiding to commit the false cause fallacy. Number 3, use statistical evidence. Causation should be supported by solid evidence, such as scientific studies, or word studies, or statistical data. It can't be supported by just anecdotal experiences or isolated incidents. You don't use an exception of a rule in order to prove the rule. So search for studies that test the actual causal link of one event to the next. And look for studies that favor explanations based on rigorous evidence over mere assumptions and biases. Number 4, speaking of biases, we need to be aware of our own cognitive biases. We should be mindful of the biases that we possess, like the confirmation bias, where people tend to look for evidence that supports their own pre-existing beliefs. So actively seek out and consider evidence that challenges your assumptions about cause and effect. Number 5, do not confuse correlation with causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean that one caused the other. Correlation may suggest there's a relationship, but it doesn't prove it. So using the phrase correlation is not causation to remind yourself to dig a little bit deeper, investigate a little bit further before drawing your conclusions. And number 6, we need to apply critical thinking. We need to ask questions that probe and evaluate the logic of the arguments that we encounter. If someone claims that there is a cause and effect relationship, we should ask how they know this and what evidence are they looking at that supports the connection that they are concluding. Question the strength of the link between point A and point B. Is there a clear connection or a process that explains how one event leads to the other? If not, we need to be very, very cautious about making a connection. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we continue to examine the logical fallacies. And next week we will look at the ambiguity fallacy. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube or iTunes, by giving us an honest review online, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you feel led to offer a donation, please check out the episode's description for a link to PayPal, or you can donate by subscribing to a monthly membership on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.